Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Biochar Initiative webinar, Navigating Carbon Dioxide Removal, the Role of Policy, Regulation, and Value Chains. We're going to be joined today by two CDR sector luminaries, Sebastian Manhart and Jason Dodier, who will introduce themselves in more detail in a minute, in the unlikelihood that you aren't already familiar with their work. I'm Wendy Lou Maxwell Barton, the Executive Director of the International Biochar Initiative. I want to thank everyone for joining us today from over 15 countries, and we hope that you'll introduce yourself in the chat. And we also are going to launch an interactive, we're going to launch a poll right now to get a better sense of who is joining us today. Throughout the webinar, please put your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so that our panelists can consider them and answer the questions at the beginning. So we'll take just a couple minutes as people are coming in, and please answer the poll so we can share the results. Excellent. So we see that we have people joining us from all along the value chain in the biochar industry. And again, we'd love for people to take a moment to introduce themselves, their affiliation, and also their location in the chat, and then make sure to send your questions as we go along for the speakers. Very quickly, before we get to the topic at hand, I wanted to share a little bit about the International Biochar Initiative and also set the stage for today's discussion and topic. The International Biochar Initiative, or IBI, is a membership-based organization founded in 2006. We focus on advocacy for and education about biochar systems for agriculture, the built environment, environmental remediation, as well as other sectors. Next slide, please. We have a little over 400 members based in 70 countries, which include biochar producers, product makers, equipment and technology makers, a wide group within the CDR ecosystem, researchers from over 50 universities, and increasingly sustainability professionals from industries, including commodity agriculture in the global south, forest management, environmental remediation, as well as the built environment. Next slide, please. I wanted to mention quickly that we are hosting something we call the Biochar Study Tour, which is a hands-on event to explore how biochar is made and used. This year, we're doing it in Tuscany in Italy on vineyards, as well as with olive production. So we hope that you might join us there. And then I also wanted to point to our expanding education program, which will have in 2025 several events in Asia Pacific, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in North America. So we really hope to join you, or for you to join us rather, at these events. Really quickly, I want to move to the topic at hand before I turn over to Jason and Sebastian for the rest of the webinar. In a growing and relatively early stage industry like the global biochar industry, creating appropriate policies and regulations is crucial to encouraging investment, streamlining regulations, and setting standards to promote industry best practices. This in turn can create confidence for stakeholders who the biochar industry needs to help it grow. Markets for physical biochar production products, government funding for carbon dioxide removal and climate change solutions, and crucially, with investors who will help biochar entrepreneurs and startup companies scale their companies and the industry along with it. With that, I'm happy to turn over to Jason and Sebastian, and thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Wendy Lou, for hosting us and for all the great work that IBI keeps doing to develop knowledge and awareness for biochar and also the markets and policies that are needed for it. And yeah, I'll quickly introduce myself before handing it over to Jason. My name is Sebastian Manhart. I wear a couple of different hats. I guess my primary hat is I work as a senior policy advisor at Carbonfuture. Carbonfuture is a German company. You might have seen 15 minutes ago, we announced our Series A. And we develop trust infrastructure to scale durable carbon dioxide removal. So focused on both marketplace infrastructure, but also MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification infrastructure. And we've been doing a lot of work on biochar carbon removal. Probably in other relevant roles that I have worth mentioning here, I'm one of the founding directors of the US Biochar Coalition. And I'm also the chair of the board and the initiator of the German Trade Association for CDR, the DVNE. All different roles where across the world I work with governments on promoting biochar carbon removal as one of the most viable paths we have to achieve climate relevant levels of CDR. Yeah, with that, I hand it over to Jason.
Thank you, Sebastian, and congratulations to you and the entire Carbonfuture team. That's fantastic news, much needed in this space, and it's the speed and scale that we need to keep going forward. I'm honored to be here talking with Sebastian, but also on behalf of IBI. I mean, this organization for me is very, very close to my heart. As many of you might know, or you've heard me talk before, I had the pleasure early in my career to live and work in Middle East, Africa, Europe, and got to work on some really cool problems and solutions around access to energy. And today, I'm one of the co-founders of Grain Ecosystem, and really our focus is to bring that ethos forward and focus on accelerating carbon removal projects, in particular biochar. Our goal is how do we make it more accessible, efficient, and really easy at a fraction of the time to get folks where they need to go doing biochar projects, connecting them with investors, and really doing risk assessments and profitability assessments. I mean, for us, the human element is at the core of everything. And we're going to talk a lot about that in our discussion today, because if you're going to find effective solutions, it's people that matter. All these other elements come and they play a vital role, but it's people that drive policy. It's people that drive the private sector. And I think this is where we're going to really lean in and have a lot of fun today in the discussion. I'm also looking forward to the questions from the group. So without further ado, let's get started on the policy front. And when it comes to policy, I think about Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and he said climate change is the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. But he also said the response to climate change is the biggest opportunity the world has ever seen or has ever had. Now, nobody has a crystal ball. However, when you pay attention closely, you can make some predictions. And there is nobody I know of that's paying closer attention and more engaged than Sebastian. And I think let's start there, Sebastian, potentially. How do you think about this? If you look at your own little crystal ball, when it comes to policy, when it comes to compliance, give us some guidance and thoughts related to that.
Yeah, sure. And I should probably tell the audience the way that this came about is basically Jason and I were having conversations that are very similar to this one. And we realized that probably it would be quite useful for other people as well. And so we decided to essentially host a webinar where we would have a conversation about the topics that we're passionate about and knowledgeable in. And so policy at the bottom, my fundamental belief is that if we look at the solutions that have been scaled around the world over the last decades, none of that really happened without significant policy support. And if we look at the climate space, the most relevant example is obviously the scale up of renewables and solar. I'm German. I have witnessed throughout my life basically what the German government has done to investing in solar, for example. And that was significant government policy that led to a cost reduction that then allowed other countries, including especially China, to scale it to the levels that allow us to have very cheap renewable energy today. And so my fundamental belief is that we will need the private sector, of course, and we're going to talk about the role of the private sector, but the private sector won't be able to move, to invest, to buy, unless governments go first and essentially create the right frameworks and the certainty that everyone else needs to scale carbon removal.
And Sebastian, when you think about that, we talk about it a lot, but strong supportive policies for carbon removal to develop at the scale required to address climate change. That's everything from research, funding, regulatory frameworks, and market incentives. Can you dig in a little bit? I know when I talk to folks all the time around the world, it's what does this three-letter acronym mean? How is Europe helping our countries and basically informing across procurement and CAPEX and tax credits? Can you take us through that a little bit more, again, from your lens in the EU?
Yeah, I mean, CDR is, I guess, early stage enough yet that we can, in a couple of minutes, kind of cover what's happening globally, at least kind of top level. And obviously what we're seeing is very different approaches by different countries and regions. People on the webinar might be more familiar with the American approach, otherwise we can talk about it too, but it's much more focused on investing capital, on getting boots on the ground, steel in the ground, heavily focused on direct air capture, on tax credits, on CAPEX support, and it's really leading the way and taking a huge bet, for example, with direct air capture on building huge facilities like no one else in the world is doing right now. And the whole of humanity is going to benefit if that bet pays off. And what we're seeing in Europe is a much bigger focus on the foundations that are needed to scale carbon removal. And why it's maybe interesting just to quickly think about it. In the US, you have elections every 2 years and everything can change every 2 years. So you need to get things done within a 2-year time frame. In Europe, we have much more predictability. We have elections at the European level every 5 years. Europe obviously has 27 member states with national elections, but we do a lot of forward-thinking policy planning. For example, now we're working on 2040 climate targets, emission reduction and carbon removal, and they will stick. They won't be overturned after 2 years. We will have those targets in 27 member states until 2040. And I think that's important to understand when we're talking about how Europe is approaching policy. So in this case, in Europe, we have 3 big vehicles for climate action, essentially. One, which people might be familiar with, is the emission trading system. The second one, which people might be less familiar with, is the effort sharing regulation. And the third one is land use change, and forestry. Now, the first two, the ETS and the ESR between them, account for 100% of European emissions. It's a split, different industries are in different buckets, and over time, more and more industries are coming into the ETS, which is a compliance market. The LULUCF is actually a carbon sink, although that's also struggling. But those are the 3 highways that we have in Europe. And so the question, if you're thinking really ahead, is how do we integrate carbon removal? How do we integrate biochar carbon removal into the big climate action highways that we already have? To do that, so that you don't have to do it over and over again, we're creating essentially a foundational layer called the Carbon Removal and Carbon Farming Regulation, or CRCF, which a lot of you will have heard about. And this is essentially a certification framework which will allow us to answer questions like, what is permanent? What is carbon removal? What criteria does that carbon removal need to pass? How do we do MRV for that carbon removal? And that will allow us, once we have that, which it should be up and running, we can dive into the details, but it should be up and running by 2026. Then all these other big climate action vehicles that we have can simply reference the CRCF and integrate CDR. Not simply, that's a bit oversimplifying, but you get the gist. And so this is how we're thinking about it in Europe, is there is money on the table. We can go into country examples, especially because budgets are a national authority versus a European authority. But at the European level, we're very much thinking about the long term, the targets, the foundational layer.
Sebastian, it's really refreshing. As you mentioned at the beginning, Sebastian's a founding member of the U.S. Biochar Coalition, which is doing a lot of policy work. And I'm actually happen to be in D.C. this week, listening in on some of these discussions. And everything I'm hearing you say, it rings so true. And part of the issue, for example, in the U.S., you have a lot of folks that are staying in position for a long time because of seniority. And seniority plays a key role, and states want to have strong representation. But I think you hit on a lot of really important points. And we always overestimate the change that's going to occur in the next couple of years, but underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. And I think it's really important that we focus and we try to execute in the near term with an eye towards 2030. And as you rightfully stated, if these institutions and teams can help define desired outcomes better, and it could be more repeatable, we're more likely to achieve these desired results. And when you think about it, you need to have use cases, places people can reference. Is one of the questions I always get Where can I go see projects? Where can I go speak to people that have executed and done this repeatably? When you think about, as you reference, regulatory use cases, particularly from developing economies, are there a couple that you might want to call out for the group?
Yeah, I think the country that I'm drawn to a lot, especially for biochar, is Brazil. Brazil has 28% of the world's biomass, which is just a mind-blowing number. And it also has farms that are 100 times the size of an Iowa farm, and an Iowa farm is pretty damn big. And so you have two hugely important ingredients for biochar, but also for other carbon removal approaches, which is a lot of residual biomass and huge farms, quite centralized farms, where you can essentially distribute and apply the biochar. So also, by the way, Brazil has something like 87% renewable energy and geological storage for hundreds of years. So also for direct air capture, I would go to Brazil, frankly, and enhanced weathering. So it's just, for me, Brazil has to be kind of, I'm almost surprised that it's not front and center stage of all these discussions, because I guess the government hasn't really gotten behind it yet to the level that other governments have. I've been having conversations with government folks there, and I think that might change. And next year, COP is in Brazil. So I really hope that's an opportunity to kind of highlight the potential. And let's remember, biochar comes from Brazil. 2,500 years ago, Terra Preta was, we discovered it in the Amazon, right? So it's also it's a great story. There's all the potential. There's not the legislation in place yet, but I really have my eyes on Brazil. Then I would definitely highlight Kenya. Although I know of a few biochar companies that are starting off in Kenya. But Kenya, they have the government from the president himself really pushing for carbon removal as a huge export industry. They've got a lot of renewable geothermal energy. They've got the Rift Valley where they can store a lot of the CO2. And so Kenya has kind of that nice combination of environmental, geographical factors, but also political support and the recognition that they could quickly become a real hub. And you're seeing a lot of Western companies going to Kenya and setting up shop. So those are just two examples. We know in India, China, there's a lot of action as well, but that would probably be too much for today's conversation. But I imagine that these big developing economies with big domestic economies might be some of the first movers that are trying to make big bets on carbon removal.
And Sebastian, to put it in context, the average size of a farm in Iowa is about 358 acres. So that gives additional perspective to what you say. I mean, Brazil, it's a place that certainly we've watched closely. I've watched closely. I've been involved with Amazonia Fund Alliance. It's really imperative that we take the learnings out of the community and be able to find ways to strive and work together. And when you mentioned Iowa too, because I had been very US focused, one of the things I was discussing recently with, I think it was with Wendy Liu actually, the cancer rate in Iowa, 20% higher than the national average here in the US. And a big part of that is due to intensive use of pesticides and herbicides and runoff, et cetera, that gets into the waterways and water systems. And you saying that just piqued that in my mind, and I want to double down on it, because this is what we are talking about here in Washington, is what we're talking about in the EU, and places like Kenya, Brazil, Switzerland, at the forefront. They've been doing this a long time, and they can help us hopefully achieve our ambitions faster, which is very encouraging. We should never lose sight of that. So thank you for calling out those great examples. And I'm pretty sure we have representation from all of those countries on this call today, which is equally exciting. I want to take a slight...
One more thing, just because you mentioned, I want to quickly talk about Switzerland. Because Switzerland is actually doing something really interesting. Switzerland is this small country in the center of Europe that people probably know for the beautiful snow-topped mountains, but they also do interesting stuff in CDR. They are, to my knowledge, the first country in the world that has not just defined carbon removal targets for 2035, 2040, 2045, but they've defined how much of that they're going to buy from abroad. They've basically understood that they won't be able to produce all the CDR they need to achieve their targets domestically. And they have started making bilateral agreements under the UNFCCC Article 6 arrangement. And they have over a dozen agreements already with developing countries. And also other countries like Sweden, and they're currently working, which is the first in the world. They're actually the first with Sweden for the first time in history, trying to do a transfer of carbon removal between one country and another. Just 1 ton, but just to show how this bloody mechanism actually works and how it could then work at scale. So I would really call out Switzerland just for the the huge like foresight they have on how this will have to work 10, 15 years from now. And those are the countries that then Brazil or Kenya will be able to export CDR to, right? So if we don't have the demand side, the government demand for CDR, then there won't be an industry in Brazil and Kenya. So I think it's really important to stress this as an example of how this could work.
No, thanks for flagging it. We need to root out blind spots. False confidence. There's a lot of false confidence, certainly. We see it all the time. I see it all the time in my home country here in the US about ways of working and doing things. And you need countries that are at the forefront, that are driving and piloting, like Switzerland. And I'm glad we got a chance to touch on that a little bit. I know that's particularly of passion for you, Sebastian, something you've been watching closely. And I'm sure, again, for folks that are on the line that are in Switzerland, feel free to reach out and drop a note in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Now, taking a little bit of a pivot, this gets interesting, and it was certainly a topic of much debate at the last big US Biochar conference in Sacramento. A lot of major thought leaders and scientists talked out on this topic. You know, when you think about direct air capture, a lot of folks will say it's like a magical thinking tool. It's something we hope is going to save us without really requiring us to make the hard choices about reducing emissions. You know, there's a toolkit. We need to have a lot of tools in that toolkit. I guess, Sebastian, I think the audience would love to hear a little bit more about your perspective on, you know, first of all, how governments are picking winners, diversification around removals, but also a lot of the money. You know, I'm meeting with the Department of Energy later today. They've got, I think, a little over $52 million slated in near-term funding for DAC pilots. You know, you've got CDR leadership here in the US. I think they want to try to spend $10 billion by 2030 to promote technologies and direct air captures at the forefront, I think, of that. So what are your thoughts there? Because I see this all the time on direct air capture. It'd be great to get your perspective.
Yeah. Maybe taking a step back, we need to scale carbon removal from currently 2 gigatons to roughly 10 gigatons. The estimate is between 5, 15, but let's say 10 as a number that seems to have stuck quite a lot. And that sounds like a 5x increase. That's fine, right? That's easy to do. The reality is, though, that the vast majority of that will have to come from technological or permanent CDR, because we can't scale nature-based solutions beyond a certain point. And so we're actually looking at a growth rate of not 5x, but more like 5,000x based on the latest state of CDR report. Why am I saying this? Because that type of technological growth will require all shots on target and will require levels of innovation that we've only seen really in the renewables industry so far. And so if we pick winners in 2024, we will almost certainly fail, because we don't even know what technologies are going to be the winners, right? Like there might be, I'm every year I find out at least about 3-4 new approaches that I'd never heard about before. And then there's innovation within, obviously, industries, but I'm thinking completely new approaches that nobody's ever thought about. Second, even if we have like picked certain technologies, we will need a range of them, because as I explained earlier, certain geographies are suitable to certain type of carbon removal. Even within Europe, the Nordics have a lot of biomass, have a lot of experience with biomass. They're probably more likely to do BECCS or biochar, whereas other countries are more likely to do enhanced weathering or DACs. And so we cannot pick winners at this point in time. What that means for policy is we need to ensure that we have technology open policy, technology agnostic policy. While now the reality is, as you've said, that's unfortunately not what's happening, right? Like if we look at the US, there are some incredible efforts by having technology openness. And for example, the purchase price by the Department of Energy is technology open. And it has also a biochar company in there, Climate Robotics. So it is definitely trying to diversify. But if you look at the big money, the DAC Hubs program, 45Q, that's all DAC. So 95% plus of American funding for CDRs going towards one technology. In Europe, we have a technology open CSCF framework, which was a huge effort and fight from people like myself. But then the first methodologies that are developed, so the first credits or units that will be issued, are for DAC, BECCS, and biochar. Great for biochar in this case, not so good for enhanced weathering, who are just outside waiting outside that door and banging the drum while they're not inside. And so I think we need, as a community, while it's great when we are included, we should always make sure that we make a case for everyone that's not included, because next time it could be us. And humanity will only succeed if we have all shots on target.
And we know inherently picking winners in general is a risky business, even if you're picking winners in a certain country and you're not thinking geographically, because it's driven a lot of times, sadly, by short-term trends rather than long-term strategic value. And I think, Sebastian, what you just said, and again, it's the ethos of IBI and everything that we're trying to do in our respective companies. How do you bring together and build partnerships for effective action and ensure really that the policies we implement are in tune with the needs of people at the end of the day? Economic benefits, biodiversity benefits, et cetera. And when you look to future policy needs, I guess kind of rounding out some of the early elements of our policy discussion, we know the need is there clearly to accelerate and develop and implement compliance regulations and enhance the focus on some of these compliance frameworks that are there and look at alternative demand drivers, certainly the VCM and government procurement. Are there any other things you would want to hit on or highlight for the group to think about or reflect upon as it relates to future policy needs, forthcoming issues, areas where people need to lean in particular in their respective countries? I think that would be a great way to kind of round out some of the policy, and then we can look to other resources as well to stay up to date on these key trends and topics.
I'd say I don't think I could do a policy webinar about biochar and not talk briefly about Denmark. Denmark has been really leading the way on thinking about using biochar to essentially neutralize the emissions from its agricultural sector, but also to hit its climate targets. And it has recently announced that it will invest 1.4 billion euros into it, which, to put it per capita, in the US, that would be the equivalent of $90 billion of funding. Right? So it's 1.4 for a country the size of Denmark is absolutely huge. And so they're going big on biochar. And if I were a biochar company, I would really look closely at Denmark and consider maybe going there. So that's one thing I would highlight. And the other thing is just, I think compliance markets. People talk a lot about compliance markets, and I understand why. The voluntary carbon market is $2 billion at the moment. The ETS, European Trading System alone, was around 800 billion, right? So last year, so it's a completely different size. And the idea of having CDR integrated into that is very appealing to a lot of folks. And while I think that is the direction of travel, it will take a while, right? Like we won't see that. We won't see proposals until 2026. We won't see integrations until 2031. So when folks kind of put all their hopes for the near term on compliance, I think that's out of place. Compliance will help us 5, 8, 10 years from now, not 2, 3, 5 years from now. And so I think for now, we need to rely on other government programs, from procurement to subsidies to tax credits and so on. And yeah, we've mentioned some good examples of governments that are already trying to do the right thing there.
Oh, powerful stuff. And I even, you'll be proud, I even referenced in a talk earlier this week, I referenced the Nordics, highlighting some of the great work there. I think, when we think about waste to value and circular economy, Denmark is not only adopting and piloting these practices, but they're pioneering new solutions that I think are helping the rest of the world. And it really doesn't get talked about enough. I got to spend some time there when I lived in France, and I was so impressed. And I think the population is probably shy or maybe just over 6 million. So it just shows you what you can do. And you think, again, you reflect back to the US or states that have small populations. You can get stuff done in a big way, Sebastian. And I really think it's important we continue to hammer that point home. And I guess, Sebastian, in terms of staying up to date, I know you do amazing work with CDR Jobs. When people ask me about where to go on policy, I just tell them to follow you, quite honestly. I know it's an easy out from an answer perspective. I'm getting more knowledge on this topic every day and trying to stay up. I think I've written 2 pages of notes as you've been talking. But any other elements you want to call out before we shift to offsetting, insetting, and other key topics related to resources? Yeah,
sure. I mean, just in terms of kind of how I keep up to date, maybe that's also helpful for other folks. I love the work that CDR-FYI has been doing, CDR.FYI. They've really been ramping up their comms. They've been having a weekly roundup, a weekly newsletter, quarterly reports. So I think if you follow just one thing, it's CDR-FYI and all the different outlets. I also really like the analyses that Epitami is putting out, that Robert Höglund is putting out, that individuals are putting out on LinkedIn, and I find that combination is already a lot and often sufficient. And then there's great newsletters, IBI being one example. If you're interested in biochar, of course, USBC has a great newsletter, but sign up to kind of the most relevant newsletters because a lot of people are putting effort into creating knowledge in this space.
Yeah, and we're honored. I mean, we're going to have, speaking of Robert Höglund, we're going to have him on one of our panels at the Biochar Revolution event next week during Climate Week. So speaking to the tune of that, these are folks like yourself and Robert and others that are driving the industry forward and providing great real-time content that's so necessary. Cool.
Awesome. At this point, I want to flip the table. And because I come at this from a policy angle, and you, Jason, are obviously quite in the weeds and actually see what companies are doing when it comes to biochar projects, what projects are getting financed, how they're being used. And so I think there's a lot of great knowledge that you can share with the audience on this topic. And maybe for starters, because I think people often take it for granted, but can you explain the difference between offsetting and insetting?
I will gladly do that. And I don't think it's taken for granted. I think it's sometimes can be very nuanced. I've had the great fortune of talking to hundreds of folks all over the world, again, globally on this topic. And there is a lot of confusion between the two. And I come from a background of big corporate supply chain, working with value chain stakeholders. So let me give some insights and maybe hopefully some nuggets that maybe aren't as prevalent out there that can be helpful to the group. So when you think about offsetting, in this case, you have, first of all, upstream and downstream benefits. So emissions from activities outside the production process are explicitly excluded in most cases. Credits account for the group. Credits account for emissions from feedstock transportation, production, biochar processing, and shipping. And I'll tell the group today, what we're seeing is biochar is often sold separately from the CVR credits. I'm going to go into detail a little bit more in depth on this later, but the credits themselves are typically purchased by technology insurance companies and a handful of others. Again, I'm going to give examples on that as well. But there are 4 approved methodologies for biochar's role in CVR credits today that we've worked with extensively here in the US. Certainly, you've seen Climate Action Reserve, Isometric, Puro, Vera, etc. You have low tech and high tech, and the credits remain focused strictly on biochar production. And when you look, Sebastian, at flexibility here, it's really important because I get the question all the time from developers: how should we approach flexibility when it comes to doing offsetting? And the methodologies range widely, so they offer different levels of risk and focus on various data and operational aspects depending on the preferences of the project developer or the buyer in a specific project context. And so, for example, if you're a US-based project seeking carbon credits and place a high priority on, let's say, frequent lab testing of the biochar, Climate Action Reserve might be a good methodology for your project. Alternatively, if you have to do a full life cycle assessment for a facility, you've got Puro, which could be more suitable there because the LCA is mandatory under their standard. So each standard carries varying levels of operational risk. It often depends on how long they've been active in the space, or the project has been active in the space, or the supplier has been active in doing operational projects. And buyers may prefer standards with a longer track record that adds in another layer of flexibility. For me, we come at it a lot of the time, Sebastian, from the position of investors and how to de-risk these opportunities and what the role of credit markets are. And what I tell a lot of suppliers or potential suppliers is the credits often de-risk these projects. So if an investor, whether it's a structured credit investor, private credit, equity, debt, if they see a portion of your project has already been slated for pre-purchase or spot purchases, it typically can help to de-risk the project when you think about getting capital injected. So offsetting is something that we try to demystify. We try to bring a little bit more simplicity, and we try to help project developers think more tactically about how to approach offsetting and if they are even eligible. Because Sebastian, I'll tell you, and you've probably seen this, a lot of times individuals are working as if they are eligible for a particular methodology and trying to model it out when in fact they really weren't. So it's how do you bring that type of a solution to the masses to make it a little bit easier to do carbon offsetting projects.
Yeah.
And then I think your second piece on insetting,
Yeah,
which has
totally
got,
great.
or as we say, value chain emissions is something that's gotten a lot of visibility. Insetting refers to investing in sustainability initiatives within a company's own supply chain. So if you think about Pepsi, I'll go more in detail into Pepsi and Nestle, but these are sugar mills and farmers that operate within that value chain. In the industry, we could call it supply chain or shed. So basically the waste products of that supply chain could be reapplied or applied within that supply chain. And essentially you could have double benefits of removal of the waste. And in the process, as Sebastian and I were talking about earlier with some of the country use cases, increasing soil fertility as an example without double counting the credits. And you could also talk about another benefit of Insetting being that companies that have the financial advantage as well as the knowledge advantage, so basically being able to see what's happening with their own supply chain, could consolidate information and find patterns for repeatability. And this is something I've continued to hammer in a lot of discussions. We need big organizations to come to the table to really help us build out speed and scale. So I'll go more in detail, but at a very high level, Sebastian, that's kind of how I'm looking at the two things together.
Yeah, and I think the insetting use case just has so much potential, right? Because you have everything you need within that supply chain to both source the biomass, to then redistribute the biochar again. And so yeah, it's a really less talked about but huge potential use case. And if you get a company, and that's probably going to be my next question, but yeah, if you can get a huge company to play ball, you can have a lot of impact within a single supply chain. So you already kind of hinted at, for example, Pepsi, but like, what are some oh, not Nestle, I think you said. What are some of the examples that you would highlight to folks of companies that are looking at this, or even better, companies that are already doing this?
So when we look at the market collectively, and I've really tried to spend a lot of time listening to the business leaders in those companies, because I want to understand where they're at, where their head's at. I think some people may have seen recently the CSO of Pepsi was on the front page of the sustainability section of the Wall Street Journal. I think it was New Zealand, I'm not sure, but it was a biochar headline. And I saw him talk in New York City, and his big three things, crop resilience, farmer livelihoods, and then basically achieving their insetting or scope 3 objectives. So whether that's through embedding or incorporating a solution like biochar, increasing yields, soil carbon enhancement, but that gets me really excited. The question for all of us, and this is where IBI really comes in as well, how are we educating the agronomists and the stakeholders in the value chain, whether it's at Pepsi or in the farms that operate within the organization structure that make these businesses tick? How do we educate them and give them the tools and the ability to really do what they need to do? So I'll talk about two use cases, Sebastian, that I think are very prevalent when it comes to insetting. It's the ones that myself, Grain, and many others, I think, are in the weeds trying to figure out. So figure out how to make happen faster. So for example, with Pepsi, and many companies have this, back in 2022, they issued a $1.25 billion green bond supported by both their I think the CEO and CFO. And really the goal of that is to try to accelerate focus around scope 3 and enable their supply chain to decarbonize and implement solutions like biochar. When you look at Pepsi, for example, the average rate, I think a ton of carbon equivalent for them in their value chain is about $475 a metric ton when we really looked at the analysis there. So when you think about that, you think about the role biochar can play with a company like Pepsi to help support them in the value chain. They're doing a lot of testing. They're thinking, they've got a LEAF program today, so they're investing in regenerative agriculture and sustainable farming practices. And I think that their ultimate goal is to try to figure out, how do we lock in our suppliers for the long term? Because Sebastian, what a lot of people don't realize is it is the few that feed the many. They have a lot of optionality and choices. So if I'm Pepsi, or if I'm Nestle, for example, so Nestle, Nespresso, many people on the call might be aware of, they're using biochar in Brazil through Nespresso. They've been involved in sustainability initiatives that include, certainly waste reduction, but we've got 20 billion tons of coffee byproduct waste per year going into landfill. So that is a great feedstock byproduct for biochar production. So this not only helps Nestle and Nespresso to manage waste, but it turns into a valuable resource that could be fantastic for soil improvement, carbon footprint reduction. So from a pure insetting perspective, you've got every element that you would need in there. And then I said it a couple of days ago, but it's not just about shareholder value. I know that we have to, in many cases, speak in forms of turning cost centers into profit centers for big companies, because that's important for shareholders. A lot of these are publicly traded entities, but you need stakeholder commitment. And to get stakeholder commitment, you get your value chain to really believe and commit for the long term, because they do have more options than ever before. And the last thing I'll say, Sebastian, on the topic is, companies like Pepsi and Nestle, AB InBev, and the list goes on, they have a very unique opportunity today, because if they empower these value chain players to implement biochar and have these biodiversity impacts, it's going to instill great practices, and the next generation is going to get involved. Because as you said, I'm in the weeds. I meet with a lot of farmers, and it's a great privilege and something I enjoy in my job. And if there's genuine concern about the next generation wanting to stay on the farm, or wanting to stay engaged in water filtration, and obviously some of the other use cases that biochar can help to support. So it is, in its true essence, insetting can unlock circular economy and the biochar use case to get to some of the numbers that you hit on earlier in our talk.
Fantastic. And I mean, if we have people in the audience who are considering setting up some of these programs, like where do they start? What are some of the more tangible advice you might have?
Yeah, it's always going to be a combined approach. You've got to be very holistic, and you have to think about what are the things that can get you quick wins. I think in the countless discussions that I've had, one of the benefits we have at Grain is, Grain came out of a global incubation challenge through Schneider Electric, and Schneider Electric has a massive footprint globally. They make a lot of the products that are in our houses, in our businesses. And, when they talk to a lot of these big companies, a lot of these organizations are very focused on scope 1 and scope 2. They're looking for, fast wins, fast return on investment. So how do you get some of those wins? How do you build out the program? And I think you've got to start out of the gate with piloting. I think one of the things that I like to lean on is thinking through, okay, near-term adaptability. So how do you incorporate agile project management? How do you try to start smart? And how do you leverage innovation and groups like IBI to come to the table? I mean, certainly Sebastian, myself, Carbonfuture, Grain Ecosystem, IBI, we were willing to help these companies to get there faster. But you have to use agile management techniques to figure out how you can iterate quickly, adjust processes, and then respond to the evolving market conditions. But the big ask would be, do a pilot site. Most of these organizations understand at a very high level which places in their value chain, which locations are producing the most waste or have the most waste on site, the most bagasse, the most rice husks, etc. So let's start there. Let's look at a site, and then we'll look at blended finance models. I think, Sebastian, these companies have very strong balance sheets. They have the ability to do as a service. They have the ability to do JVs. I mean, you hit on a little bit earlier about the renewable space. I was part of kind of that burgeoning energy as a service space to accelerate financing into microgrids. It's the same concept here. I think you're going to see more big technology companies do joint venture partnerships with companies that do different types of finance. And then that will enable adaptable contracts to help with structuring purchase agreements, structuring carbon credit agreements. And the last thing I'll say, Sebastian, is we are seeing some companies that are part of, that will play a big role in this. Companies like a Cargill, as an example, it's brilliant because they're very excited about carbon markets and the role of carbon markets and the ability to trade credits and use the cash from trading those credits to essentially benefit the value chain. So you got to think about it for how do you get the quick wins? How do you enable the value chain? How do you leverage compliance? And then ultimately technological adaptation. That's really that's the role I think these companies have played the best so far, was helping us avoid tragedy of the commons by taking bets early to help with technological adaptation. But we need a lot more of it with biochar.
And we're very grateful for the companies that have led the way here. And I mean, you already mentioned blended finance, but one of the things that keeps coming up in my conversations with folks trying to set up biochar projects is just how to finance them, right? And I know that that's obviously one of your expertises at Grain. So What would you say to financing options for biochar projects?
Financing options are unique. It's still the sad reality today. It's still a little bit more of an art form in our space with biochar. So it's not, it hasn't taken hold as we've seen with certainly the renewable space and the tens of billions of dollars of capital. Part of the reason when people ask me, why have you stayed in New York City? Part of the reason is I'm trying to educate a lot of those funds and folks that I've worked with in a past life to really focus on this space and understand the investment thesis of biochar. I have a lot of people tell me, while the returns on my project look so good, I'm afraid to show those returns to investors. That's really what that is, Sebastian, is we need to have more projects executed to be able to justify, because the returns are real. The attractiveness of this space is good. And I think, yes, we want to double down on the voluntary market. We want to ensure we have traceability and credibility, and certainly DMRV is hyper important. And that's one of the reasons biochar has gotten so sticky out of the gate. And a lot of our investors want to look at biochar projects. We are always trying to double down on non-dilutive capital. The big thing for me is, how do you leverage the grants and the subsidies to ensure that you're able to, to get what you need to get started? The biggest issue, Sebastian, that we see today is people that are doing project number one. They don't really have the backlog of projects. So how do you get that initial capital? How do you get that bridge capital? We have seen some solutions come to the table. Family offices, impact investors have been extremely helpful there. But also, tapping into agricultural and waste management financing. And the biggest thing at the end of the day, it goes back to Insetting and the big companies that you and I have been talking about and talking to. We need them to come to the table. Most of these projects are in their value chain. It shouldn't just be that the projects getting funded today are the big pre-existing, food processing facilities and mills, lumber mills, sugar mills, timber mills that have been existing for a long time and have strong cash flows. We need other businesses that maybe haven't done projects or don't have strong balance sheets. And we do that by creating a structured business case and presenting it to these big organizations and investors that have a shared interest in that whole value chain.
And I mean, how do you, because these companies, and maybe this could also be kind of a final question before we dive into some of the questions that have popped up in the chat now. How do these companies balance kind of the short-term requirements that they might have and needs as an upcoming biochar project with, strategic thinking, strategic planning, thinking also about compliance, regulation, all the things we talked about earlier. What advice do you give to companies?
So I think back, and this goes to resources. One of the good books I read recently was by Tom Steyer, a big name here in the US. He wrote a book called Faster, Better, Cheaper. He talks about a lot of net new technologies and innovation within big companies that are focused on all the stuff, Sebastian, that we're passionate about and we chat on. And one of the things that he said in the book is really, you have to place bets. You have to focus on improving things out initially. So one of the technologies he talks about is a company called Carbonfuture, and they're focused on capturing and utilizing CO2 in concrete production. That's been a great use case so far. I think, Sebastian, we need to take, and I didn't get to talk about it near enough. It will be a hot topic next week during Climate Week. I think we're going to have a representation from Lafarge Holcim. But I think like some of the things that are happening on the cement side are a great example, because it's very, very practical and you see immediate return. So with Lafarge as an example, they're one of the largest building materials companies in the world. They're actively engaged in sustainability initiatives, exploring alternative materials to reduce carbon footprint of concrete. So they see immediate return on investment doing pilot projects with biochar and exploring basically how biochar, and showcasing and writing papers on how biochar is contributing to reducing carbon intensity on concrete. So I think, to your question, it's something that needs obviously a lot more, but I would really push the group to check out some of the work that's being done as it relates to both Nespresso on the, with Nestle on the biochar side, because that's got some really good, juicy content. And then concrete has been fantastic. Potting media as well with companies like Lowe's, Target, Walmart. I think that's going to be a very interesting one to watch in the long term, because you can show an immediate ROI in your value chain. But I think it's just looking at the case studies of the companies, the very few companies that have actually done it, to help move faster.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And yeah, I wasn't aware of many of these examples until you made me aware. So thanks for that, Jason. And maybe one thing I should also say, thank you to everyone who submitted questions during the sign up. We did try our best to review them beforehand and feed them into this conversation. And I think that many of the questions that you raised have already been addressed. If they haven't and you still have that question, please put it in the Q&A now. What I recommend is at this point, we can look at the Q&A and kind of pick questions and answer them. I'm happy to go first while Jason also looks through it. And I see a question here from Andreas on co-benefits, and I think that's and how that's addressed in policy. And I think that's very, very important one. Because clearly, if we have two things, all things being equal, we want the one that doesn't just remove a ton of CO2 permanently, but also has a ton of co-benefits, which we know biochar does. And it is one of the things that I notice is that everyone talks about co-benefits, and co-benefits play a big role in both regulation and in purchase buyers clubs. But at the end of the day, they're not valued yet. They don't have a monetary value, right? And so, unfortunately, I find that they are often a nice to have. They are something that buyers you can throw in the mix or policymakers, and it will look good, and they might have a slight preference compared to other things, but it's not something that's going to sway the decision. There are other things that sway the decision. I mean, direct air capture, you literally put a sensor on a tube, and you know exactly how much CO2 is going down that pipeline, right? So that is what policymakers are paying more attention to. So all to say that co-benefits are incredibly important. I hope we get to a point where they are more directly valued and priced. Because as of today, my personal opinion is that they're not really priced into the price of CDR credits yet.
Sebastian, I see, well, there's a lot. I see one though, and I'm going to call this one out because I get this a lot. And it basically is, can addition, I think it says additionally, but I think it's additionality be justified in the current landscape when biochar and wood vinegar have good commercial
really
value?
Question.
Yeah, how to navigate that, because, right, byproducts are key. Some of the top projects we've seen that have gotten financing tend to have 3 revenue streams. On average, I think I heard yesterday, 8% of projects globally have energy production as part of those projects. Again, this is a stat I heard. I haven't validated that, but it was an interesting statistic. But look, this is a nascent market. We have high price variability, and there is uncertainty in getting long-term offtake. That's why you heard my very impassioned talk on insetting and getting these big corporates to the table. We need longer-term contracts. That's what makes the energy markets tick with long-term ESA agreements. But additionality could be more complicated than just financial additionality in the VCM. So if the activity is common practice or not is also really important to understand. And if there's barriers to that activity that prevents adoption, that's really critical. And what I mean by barriers is non-financial barriers, social, institutional, technical. So it is a tricky question. It's very dependent on the geography and where it's taking place, but that is kind of how we are approaching it. We do have a couple of projects that actually have biochar and wood vinegar together, so I'm happy to elaborate on this further. And we are planning to do a write-up on this topic with the byproduct, because Sebastian and I talk about a lot together. These projects are getting more complex. There are more revenue streams. So how do you need to think through those related to the VCM and traditional offtake? So hopefully that gives a little bit of context and some thought to think through as you look at these other byproducts.
Excellent. And maybe we'll do 1 or 2 final questions, and then I'm going to hand over to Wendy Lou just for the wrap up. One thing I see here from Kilian is what steps are being taken to ensure the permanence of biochar-based CDR. I would really encourage you, and maybe we can share that in the notes here as well, to check out some of the latest research that has been done on it. The EBI, the European Biochar Industry Consortium, which I also am very active in, have actually released a report earlier this year, I think in April, summarizing this research. It's publicly available. And there's been a lot happening on biochar permanence on the science side, especially with essentially petrochemists coming into the field and analyzing something that they know very well, carbon, but from a different perspective. And nowadays we see governments, including the EU, putting biochar from a permanence perspective basically on the same level as DAX and MEX, which I think is quite telling. And so the punchline here is we now have ways of testing the permanence through something called inertinite testing, which gives us the exact percentage of a biochar that will not degrade and that is permanent. So we have some really incredible tools now to essentially back up these permanence claims through science. But that has to obviously still make their way into the standards, into all the different things that have been set up based on science that is a bit older and potentially a bit outdated. But yeah, so I encourage people, I think it was already shared, to check out the report. Yeah, Jason, do you have one more that you want to address?
No, I'll just say one little thing on the question on biochar credits are more expensive. I think the point that I just want to highlight here is, and Sebastian, as Sebastian said, I mean, you could just go look at CDR.fy and see the statistics. Certainly fastest time to deliver, but really doubling down on the co-benefits. I mean, you don't have to go out and talk about paying a premium, but it's how you articulate that when it comes to pricing and putting these. And actually, I talked to a CSO of a very highly visible company a few months ago, and the feedback was, I don't have to worry about getting pulled to the podium investing in biochar projects because there is a much lower risk, essentially, of reversal. And again, with a great MRV solution, it's so much easier for us to be pragmatic and stay in front of it. But again, more research continues to make sure we have good and complete data to be able to model permanence of biochar. And we're confident in our abilities to continue to drive forward. And I've taken note. There's been a lot of questions on credit, so we'll have to do a write-up to further address some of these things. But I just want to highlight the co-benefit element of that, and the fact that biochar represents most of the retired credits is really really key. But that would be my final note, Sebastian.
Thank you, Jason. And my final note is just follow both of us on LinkedIn. I think we're both prolific, and so if you want to continue the conversation, reach out, follow the content that we share there. And then I would hand it over back to IBI and Wendy Lu, and thank from my side for everything. And yeah, feel free to wrap it up.
This was awesome. I hope to see everybody in Italy. Wendy Lu, floor is yours.
No, mostly just to thank you both for sharing your insights. I'm personally, and imagine many people who are tuned in are going to be digesting this, and also to let everyone know that we will have recorded this and we will be sharing it on the IBI YouTube channel. So without further ado, thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your evening or days.
Thanks everyone for stopping by. Bye.
Take care, everybody.